If Russia shoots down another commercial jet, NATO will respond with airstrikes on Kaliningrad. What's happening, guys? Let's take a look at some breaking news coming out of Eastern Europe today. If you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm or fuel Al Gore's rhythm. But doing so could provoke Russia to consider it an act of war, meaning that Russia will continue to send bombers and fighter jets into Ukrainian airspace to fire unguided rockets on Ukrainian positions. Now, the reason why they are probably doing this is because Russia is likely running low on precision-guided munitions. Remember, these rockets aren't very precise. We have made it clear that if there is another attack on a civilian plane, it will be considered an attack on all NATO countries. That's a total of 180 combat aircraft. Not only that, but it's also home to several air defense brigades responsible for defending against NATO aircraft over the Baltic. So if Russia shoots down another commercial aircraft, then expect airstrikes against the 11th Air Army and its air defenses. In other words, they're closing the straits, the Bosporus, and the Dardanelles. And this is a worrying sign that Russia is preparing for an escalation. Remember, Russia has threatened to close the Black Sea Straits multiple times before, but every time they backtracked after they received condemnation from the UN and NATO. But this time may be different. And that's because Russia has convinced itself that it's already facing a NATO alliance, so there's no point in pretending anymore. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one. And let me tell you, the folks in Kaliningrad are already on edge, because rumors have been spreading throughout the base that NATO is planning an imminent airstrike against them, an aggressive position of a number of NATO countries which pumped weapons into Ukraine, essentially turning it into a puppet regime. Soon as civilian ships enter the dangerous area, the Russian side will assume that they are carrying military cargo. We warn that attempts to use civilian vessels to deliver military cargo to Ukraine will be considered as an unfriendly move towards the Russian Federation. I'm sure that's why morale is so low among the pilots and airmen stationed at Kaliningrad. And if that's the case, then why not get rid of the supply trucks in the warehouses while you're bombing everything else? Guys, this conflict is getting more and more dangerous by the day. Things are escalating quickly, and there are clear signs that Russia is preparing for a major escalation. If you want to know more about what I'm talking about, I released a video earlier this week discussing 5 indicators that Russia is preparing for a major escalation. You can find the video here. It's an important video, and I encourage you to watch it if you haven't already. It wouldn't surprise me if Russia started targeting gas stations and supermarkets. Anywhere where foreign aid workers may be gathering. It's despicable, but that's the mentality of a cornered animal. But this is extremely dangerous. And if this mentality continues, then I would not be surprised if Russia shot down another commercial aircraft in the region. Now, remember, NATO has a collective defense agreement. In other words, Russia knows that there will be consequences for downing another commercial aircraft. There will be airstrikes against Russian airfields and air defenses. Now, the question is, does Russia care? Or do they feel like they're in a corner with no other options left? Because this is starting to look like a cornered animal situation. And if that's the case, then you never know what kind of desperate measures they may take. If one NATO country is attacked, then all NATO countries are technically at war with Russia. So if Russia shoots down another commercial airliner, then all bets are off. Then there will be a massive response. And that response will almost certainly include airstrikes against Russian air bases and possibly even Russian air defenses. And the first place that would likely be targeted would be Kaliningrad, which is home to Russia's 11th Air Army. So it's hard to imagine that they were effective against military targets. But Russia has plenty of these types of rockets left, whereas they're running low on the good stuff, the precision-guided munitions that actually work. So they're probably using up these cheap, ineffective rockets against civilian targets in western Ukraine in an attempt to force Ukraine to conserve their more valuable air defense systems for defending against the rocket artillery. In other words, they want to force Ukraine to waste their good air defenses against bad Soviet-era rockets. And we all know how unpredictable Putin can be. So it's a tough position for Ukraine to be in. But I'm curious what you guys think. How would you handle this situation? Would you rather take the risk of having your cities bombed, or would you rather intercept these Russian jets in international airspace? It adds fuel to his jet and signals that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of news. Russia has just performed a series of airstrikes against Ukraine, but it wasn't your typical airstrikes, because Ukrainian air defenses cannot operate inside of Russian airspace. without risking a full-scale invasion. But what they failed to account for is the presence of NATO assets in the region. And according to recent reports, NATO is now considering a response to these attacks on civilian infrastructure. Now, Russia should not be targeting civilian infrastructure. It's one thing to intentionally target military infrastructure, but it's another thing entirely to intentionally target civilians. That's called a war crime. It could result in serious consequences for Russia. They didn't use cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. Instead, they used aircraft. The first option is to take the hit, to accept that occasionally one of these rockets may land on a civilian target, which is exactly what happened yesterday when a multi-story apartment building was hit, killing 11 people. It was a direct hit on this apartment building. So there's no doubt that it was intentional. But Russia's explanation for this, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, is that they were targeting weapons depots near the residential building. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never seen a weapons depot located in the middle of a residential apartment complex. In fact, I've never even heard of such a thing, because weapons depots, especially large ones, are always located well outside of residential areas. They always located in secluded spots with lots of space where an explosion, and endanger civilian lives. So to say that you were targeting a weapons depot that was located right next to a civilian apartment building filled with hundreds of civilians is either a bold-faced lie or gross negligence. But either way, it doesn't reflect well on the Russian military. Russian aircraft that flew into Ukrainian airspace and fired a barrage of unguided rockets at Ukrainian positions. Now, the good news is that according to the report, all of the rockets missed their intended target, so no casualties were reported. But what is interesting about this is that the Russian aircraft fired these rockets from within Russian airspace, so they were not vulnerable to air defense systems along the border. This makes it very difficult for Ukraine to defend against these types of attacks, because they couldn't risk firing on these aircraft because then they would be violating Russian airspace. At least that's how I read the situation. Let me know if I'm missing something. But as far as I can tell, these areas right here where the attack originated are well within Russian territory. So Ukraine really has two options here. Ukraine's other option is to intercept these aircraft in international airspace before they reach the border and before they can launch these rockets. Now, according to the commander of Ukraine's Air Force, they believe that Russia will continue to carry out these types of attacks now. Russia may have thought that they were being clever by flying these jets from inside of Russian airspace. According to Polish President Duda, he stated, "If there is another attack on a civilian plane, then there will be a reaction of the entire alliance." This army consists of 3 regiments of Su-27s, 2 regiments of MiG-31s, 2 regiments of Su-30s, and 1 regiment of MiG-41s. But it doesn't stop there. According to a new report, NATO has reportedly intercepted communications between Russian generals discussing the potential response from NATO. Russia says it will close the Black Sea to civilian shipping. Here's what the Russian Foreign Ministry had to say. We proceed from the unacceptably biased. So here's what I think is happening. Russia is intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure in western Ukraine because they believe that Ukraine is receiving weapons shipments from NATO. And if that happens, we will see an immediate response from NATO, which includes airstrikes against Russia. Guys, thanks for watching.